42-year-old cold case with a long-awaited identification of a body found in the Stillaguamish River. For decades, that person was known only as Stilly Doe.
We didn't know about this finding this body. The person that found it, I know very well after we moved back to Savannah.
On July 23, 1980, a young farmer from a small peaceful town in Washington came across the remains of what looked to be a man. The autopsy later revealed it to be a man in his late 50s. The remains had been there for about a month. The forensic investigation, which was still in its infancy, revealed very little about the man. He was later given the moniker John Doe. Hi, and welcome back to Mysterious Hook. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the mysterious 42-year-old John Doe case. Even though he was gone for more than 4 decades, why did no one file a missing report? Who was this man? How did the family react after 42 years of disappearance? Watch till the end to find out. Our story today takes us to the city of Arlington. It is one of the most beautiful river valleys in western Washington. Snohomish County has a rich and vibrant history of logging and agriculture. After World War I, agriculture, dairy farming, and shingle mills were some of the main sources of income for the residents. After the Second World War, Arlington remained a typical small American town, with logging and agriculture as the main source of livelihood for many. Life was normal by those standards, but it wasn't until the 1960s that the population grew by more than 400%. Our case today takes us to this place at a time 40 years ago, when a teenage boy discovers unidentified remains of a man in the most famous river in all of western Washington, the Stillaguamish River. It was July 23, 1980. Spencer Fuentes was a young farmer and a devoted Protestant who went to the Lutheran church in Savannah. Spencer had his trousers carelessly rolled up above his knees with his ankles submerged in water as he threw streamers and dry flies to bait a fish. In Arlington, fly fishing was quite the trend in those days. Spencer was at the Stillaguamish River on his blueberry and hazelnut farm, working on his skill as an angler. He was alone at the time when he caught a whiff of a stench. It was invasive but tolerable, and so he began looking around for the source. It must have been a dead animal, was what he thought to himself as he looked around the premises. And that is when he found something he would have never expected. He saw something floating between the logs at the riverbank, and when he walked closer to look, he saw a man's arm with his fingers dangling on the log, with the rest of his body submerged under the river. He didn't dare go any closer and hurried back to the nearest police station. The sheriff's deputy responded with skepticism, as no one had reported someone missing. But he went with Spencer to speculate anyway. The deputy later confirmed it to be a body. Soon, the backup arrived and they took the remains into custody. An investigation ensued and they began checking the perimeter. The deputies could only concur that it could have been anything. It could have been a suicide or maybe another fly fisherman enthusiast who met with an accident while swinging his fishing line. He was wearing a dark suit jacket and cotton pants, and all they had was 3 letters on the belt: G, R, and N to work with. Before we move forward, we would like to thank Athena Interior for sponsoring our video. Athena Interior has such impressive interior decor products for your kitchen space, your living space, your bedroom, and even your laundry room. These products have such an amazing aesthetic with contemporary designs. You definitely would need to have them in your home. So do check them out today. Use code COLD20 to get 20% off. Link in the description. Buy now. These could be the initials of his name, but could just as well be anything else. They determined the age of the deceased to be anywhere between 37 to 70. But that was too wide a range to work with. The river wasn't deep, and it certainly wasn't deep enough to drown. But it could still be a possibility, and the condition that the body was in made it certain that the person must have been dead for months. When a body is submerged in water for long periods of time, anything can happen. There could be predatory animals looking for food, and there could be bloating in the remains from the bacterial activities, putrefaction, and soft tissue discoloration. All of these factors make it hard for the investigators to identify the deceased and proceed further with the investigation. July is the warmest and driest month in Washington, and the temperature of the water could turn the skin into soapy fatty acids called grave wax. The only probable explanation they could infer was drowning, but it was later ruled out when the autopsy reports came in. Dr. Clayton Haberman, who performed the autopsy, cited the cause to be apparently natural. The autopsy reports determined that the decedent had no signs of trauma or any signs of drowning. While they did find water in the lungs of the deceased, that was just because the person was in the water for a long time. But the reports had a section that could easily solve the mystery. The person had severe coronary artery disease, and that was much more likely the cause of his death. It is a fairly common disease among the elderly and those with diabetes, high blood pressure, and alcohol issues. A condition when the arteries that carry blood to the heart get hard and narrow. The case was solved and it was not a murder. But who was this man? According to Dr. Haberman's report, the deceased was a male who stood 5 foot 7 inches tall and weighed about 150 pounds. They were not able to pinpoint an age, but he had gray hair, indicating he was on the older side. The deputies could not just take a picture and put it in the newspapers, as the face was barely recognizable. With very little to work with, they sought help from a dentist. Dr. Keith Leonard sifted through his dental records, comparing the deceased's teeth with the files of known missing persons. As expected, all efforts went in vain. With no hope, the Snohomish County Coroner's Office tagged the decedent as John Doe No. 2 and put the name in a file with a case number 80-7-526. About 3 weeks after the discovery of the decedent, on the 15th of August 1980, John Doe No. 2 was buried at the Arlington Cemetery by the Weller Funeral Home. But the deputies never stopped looking. It was a common practice to bury John Doe's or unidentified remains back then. But these days, the unidentified skeletal remains which are discovered are kept at the Snohomish County Medical Examiner's Office until they find the family. The skeletal remains were buried under a plot. The grave was marked John Doe, 1980, which just seemed like a dignified, unmarked grave. The deputies were tirelessly working on the missing cases, comparing these John Does to many records of people who had vanished without a trace. It was 2008 when a cold case detective, Jim Scharf, from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, teamed up with a retired Superior Court judge of Snohomish County, Ken Calsert. When they finally had hope, they began reopening unsolved homicide cases and comparing them with all the John and Jane Does in Snohomish County. By then, DNA technology had evolved enough for them to be able to solve these cases, or at least partially identify them. But these unidentified people were already resting in their graves, and during the initial investigations, no DNA samples were taken. They wrote a permission letter to exhume the remains from the Arlington Municipal Cemetery, but the entire process of obtaining the exhumation permits and conducting the DNA testing could take years. In late 2017, while the world prepared for Christmas, the deputies and the representatives from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and the Medical Examiner's Office were at the Arlington Municipal Cemetery, exhuming the remains from the grave. Some parts of the remains were taken to the Medical Examiner's Office for DNA extraction. They gathered these DNA from many. They had a lot of John Doe genome to work with, and so the Medical Examiner's Office further nicknamed it I-5 Stilly Doe. The process took time, and about 6 months later, in May 2018, this newfound DNA information was uploaded to National Missing and Unidentified Persons Systems, or NAMUS, a federal database that is funded by the National Institute of Justice. The database keeps a track of all the information of anyone missing, unidentified, and unclaimed from all around the nation. The database has dental records, fingerprints, and basically anything that can help them identify individuals. The database was still growing, and so after they had uploaded the details, all they could do was wait. NCIC, or National Crime Information Center Database, is the FBI's database, which is a computerized index that keeps a track of crimes and incidents, including missing person cases. Forensic odontologist Dr. Gary Bell took a dental radiograph of the decedent, dubbed John Doe No. 2, charted the teeth, and then uploaded them to NCIC, but that was, again, to no avail. But with the new advancements in technology, they had a lot of other ways to make it work. A month later, a forensic artist took all of the existing information on John Doe No. 2 and drew a facial reconstruction entirely based on facial morphology. The forensic artist, Natalie Murray, prepared a drawing that wasn't a photographic image, but an interpretation of the person based on the information provided. These drawings were meant to resemble the missing person and were made in hopes that someone might recognize the man. But that was to no avail. It had been 38 years since the body was discovered, and they must have thought it would take a miracle for someone to remember someone who they knew 38 years ago. Dr. Kathy Taylor stepped up and investigated further. They had almost everything on the man. With a forensic facial reconstruction by Natalie Murray and Dr. Kathy Taylor's estimation of the man based on the remains, this is what they had. The man could be of Native American, Caucasian, or Hispanic origin. A 45 to 60-year-old man standing 5'9" with coronary artery disease. Although there was no perimortem trauma, the remains did indicate the man had damaged his ribs at some point of time in his life. There was evidence of well-healed rib and spinal compression fractures. The investigation had already taken too long. The sheriffs retired, but the search didn't. The researchers took a shot at mailing a section of a thigh bone, the femur, to the University of North Texas Health Sciences Center for DNA extraction, and to be uploaded to CODES. CODES, or Combined DNA Index System, is where all of the DNA information is stored and compared. CODES aims to be the biggest DNA database. When the university obtained a full mtDNA and STR profile of the deceased, they uploaded them to CODES. But that did not help either. It was normal for a DNA profile to not yield any matches, as the database was fairly new. In the following years, Snohomish County tried a number of methods, including going back to the files, matching and ruling out these new components like STR testing, dental records, and others. By 2021, genetic genealogy had gathered quite a name for itself. The method had provided positive results over the past 2 years, and they were able to identify several John Does. And this time, a fraction of I5 Stilly Doe's thigh bone was sent for DNA extraction. They asked Othram Incorporated to prepare DNA profiles suitable for the forensic genetic genealogy database. The 41-year-old femur was in the Othram labs for about 5 months until they successfully obtained a sufficient DNA extraction after multiple rounds of extracts and enrichments. Finally, they managed to build a DNA profile that could be uploaded to the genealogical database. The Snohomish County Medical Examiner's Office uploaded the DNA profile received from Othram Incorporated to GEDmatch. It is a global database of DNA data, a free utility DNA site built for genetic genealogy research. Finally, there was a match, but it was a distant cousin in a 5th to 7th range. There was a high chance that they might not even know the person, but this lead was enough to spark a new interest in the case. Building a usable family tree usually requires a second cousin match or something closer to establish a proper connection. A kin forensics investigator, Deb Stone, began working on the case, and in May 2022, the Stilly Doe profile was uploaded to a database called FamilyTreeDNA.com. This too yielded very low results, but what mattered was that there were new matches. These matches piled up together in a single family tree could perhaps finally solve the mystery of John Doe No. 2. Deb Stone began putting 2 and 2 together, looking for family members near the areas where the body was first discovered. 42 years is a long time, and it was very unlikely for a distant cousin to remember someone from that many years ago. The woman she was going to meet had descendants in the state of Washington. This was a distant cousin, but a cousin nonetheless. When Deb Stone interviewed her, she recalled a relative who once told her about an uncle who went missing from Arlington back in the 1980s. The investigators finally had a name: Othaniel Philip Ames. But that was a huge if. The Othaniel they described was told to be 82 years old when he went missing, but the DNA profile and other reports estimated that the remains were of a person who must be in his 40s to 60s. For a DNA reference, they took DNA samples from a granddaughter, which ultimately was the nail in the coffin. John Doe number 2 and I-5 Stilly Doe were indeed Othaniel Philip Ames. Dr. Matt Lacey, the chief medical examiner, officially identified John Doe number 2 as Othaniel Philip Ames in September. Othaniel told his family that he was going on a trip before he left, a month before his remains were found. He said he was going to take a tour of the country and meet his friends and relatives starting from the West Coast. It was much more likely to be a suicide case where an old man is gradually giving away everything he possesses. Before his disappearance, Othaniel gave a Bible about the size of a passport to his grandniece, Kay Taylor. She says that this was on Thursday, the 8th of January, 1980, as it was written on the dedication page. He gifted his old car, which was only worth a couple of $100s, to Diane Elledge and her husband. Elledge recalls Othaniel whispering to them that he had hidden $20 somewhere in the car as an emergency fund. Othaniel also gave them a vintage shotgun. While she did not know why he gave those things to her, her sister thinks it is because he liked the married couple as they had invited him to their wedding. Elledge said something very sad about Othaniel. She said that he knew the end was near, and he was very ill. He just went up into the woods to die there. Othaniel also gave his house away to a nursing student who might have been his neighbor at the time. The irony here is how, in a press conference, Margaret Ames talks about Spencer and how they met.
We didn't know about finding this body. The person that found it, I know very well after we moved back to Savannah.
The young teen who discovered the remains of Othaniel Philip Ames at the time, Spencer Fuentes, actually met Margaret Ames, the daughter-in-law of Othaniel Philip Ames, when she moved back to Savannah with her husband in the early 1990s, 10 years after the incident. She met Spencer Fuentes through the Lutheran Church, but they never talked about rivers or remains. Doug Ames, Othaniel's grandson, took the day off work to meet Spencer Fuentes and his family. Othaniel Philip Ames was born on the 23rd of August, 1898 in Elwood, Iowa. He saw some of the worst days in his life as he was only 20 years old when World War I broke out. He lived in a small town called Bonesteel in South Dakota, and the entire town only had 600 people at the time. Othaniel had to leave his hometown for better job opportunities and quality of life like many other young people living in Bonesteel. Today, only 249 people are living there. In 1929, he went on to marry Lydia Newth, a 25-year-old woman, in a town with only a couple dozen residents at the time. A place called Cottonwood is located in South Dakota, and even today only 11 people live in the entire town. Life was hard, and the approaching stock market crash meant it was going to get harder. The shadows of war had engulfed the nation, and it was chaos everywhere. Othaniel was there trying to save his family, trying to survive. About 7 years later, the Ames family decided to move. The entire family moved across the country. A man, a pregnant wife, and their kids with a trailer latched onto their car. Othaniel and his sons worked hard and built a farm on 22 acres of land. The family kept 7 dairy cows, and Othaniel became a milkman. Lydia would cook on a wood stove, and Othaniel would milk the cows and farm. Those days, life wasn't as easy as it is now, and the war made it even harder. Apart from farming, Othaniel also had a lathe in his basement where he would carve salt and pepper shakers, among other things which he would just give away. Othaniel also began working at a shingle mill, and when he had time to spare, he'd make dandelion wine. He wasn't the type to sit around. He always kept himself busy. Life taught him the hard way, and he grew up to be a stern man. But life wasn't easy, and it was as though he was always looking for reasons to be happy, always looking for a way to distract himself. Tragedy struck when one of their daughters died in a car crash while she was on her way to her 10th high school reunion. Even though they never had an official divorce, the married couple got separated sometime in the 1960s. The family was in fragments as both the sons joined the military when they were teenagers. One of them served in the Air Force and married a young Norwegian woman in Savannah. After the separation, the Ames family sold their farm, but most importantly their home, which they built after facing so much hardship. Lydia moved to Everett, and Othaniel went on to live in a small cabin in the woods, all alone, somewhere near Arlington, along the Eby Mountain Road. He had a very minimal lifestyle, and all he had with him was his pet dog, who knew how to close doors by backing into them. I guess it's safe to say he was an avid outdoorsman. There he grew dahlias and kept to himself. He was a loner, and all he wanted was peace. The log cabin was comfortable enough for one person, even though he did not have an indoor bathroom, but he had hollowed out a huge stump to compensate for it. He spent the last of his days at the log cabin alone with his dog. The last time Diane Elledge saw him, he was ill. It was evident during the autopsy that he had severe coronary artery disease. In his last moments, he knew it was the end, and so he chose to leave silently. It is ironic how Margaret Ames is around the same age now as Othaniel Ames was when they finally found him. This case shows how modern ways of life have created a huge gap between parents and children. Othaniel chose to stay alone and away from everyone, even during the times when he needed someone to stay beside the most, as he did not want to be a burden. Thank you for watching, and let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments section. Stay safe, friends.